Della Rourke dug her husband's grave with her own hands. The town of Cedar Bluff watched from the fence line and did not lift a shovel. It was February. The ground was frozen a foot down. She broke it with a mattock and a straight back, and when it was done she stood in the wind and did not weep where they could see. She did not ask them for anything. Not then. Not after. 2 winters passed, and when Gideon Vane's cattle began to stagger on the green grass, when they walked blind into fences and starved with their bellies full, that same town saddled up and rode past her door. They rode 40 miles to fetch a stock doctor. They passed the one woman in the valley who already knew. The latter fee foreman said it plain, in front of 9 hands, and they laughed. We don't take cattle sense from a woman who can't feed a chicken. But Della already knew the plant that was killing them. She knew the bitter green cure a Shoshone friend had taught her long years before, in a season of fever. She said nothing. She only walked to the fence and watched. A $2,400 note. A whole herd. A proud man, all of it starting to die on its feet, right there in front of her, while the men who mocked her rode the wrong direction. If you've ever been judged by your dress instead of your heart, this story is for you. Before we ride on, if a story about the quiet ones finally being seen is the kind you'd sit with, take a second and subscribe. And comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story rides. Now, let me take you back to Cedar Bluff, Colorado, in the fall of 1879. The half-acre sat at the ragged edge of the latter fee range, where the good grass thinned out into stone and sage. There was a cabin on it no bigger than a corn crib, a lean-to for 1 milk cow, and a garden. The garden was the thing. Anyone riding by saw a poor woman's vegetable patch, cabbages gone to seed, a row of onions, some scraggly herbs a widow might dry for her supper. They were not wrong about the cabbages. They were wrong about everything else. Down the far row grew arnica she had carried up from the creek bottoms as slips. There was yarrow for a wound that would not close, and boneset for the sweats, and a low bitter thing with a black root that she never named to a soul. There was a plant she'd walked 11 miles to find, one spring, and dug up on her knees, and brought home wrapped in a wet flour sack so it would live. It lived. Half that garden was medicine. And nobody knew, because nobody looked, and Della Rourke had learned young that a woman is safest when nobody looks. She was 38 that fall. Dark hair with a hard part down the middle, twisted back plain. She had a way of standing that made her look shorter than she was, shoulders drawn in, eyes down, taking up as little of the world as a body could. It was not shyness, it was strategy. A poor widow who kept her eyes on the ground did not get talked about at the store. She did not get remembered. And being unremembered, she had found, was very close to being safe. Mornings she gathered eggs. The hens were good layers, and she was proud of them in a private way, though she would sooner have died than said so to the foreman who called her a woman who couldn't feed a chicken. She sold the eggs in town. She took in mending. She had hands that could set a sleeve, or splint a lamb's leg, or grind a root to powder, and all 3 paid about the same in Cedar Bluff, which was to say almost nothing. At her table sat a wooden mortar and pestle. Her husband Tom had carved it. The bowl was smooth from her palm, dark where the oils of 100 herbs had soaked into the grain. She ground with it most evenings, by the one lamp, working a pinch of this and a spoon of that into powders she kept in twists of paper. That night she was grinding dried yarrow, and the cabin smelled green and clean, and she talked to the mortar the way lonely people talk to the things a dead man made. Tom made you the winter before the fever took half the valley, she said, low, to nobody. An old friend taught me the plants that year. You remember. The pestle turned. The powder went fine as flour. Outside, the wind came down off the high range and worried at the shutter, and beyond the wind, far off, a steer bawled. It was a strange note in it. She lifted her head and listened. She did not go to the door. But she noted it, the way she noted everything, and filed it away. The latter fee was in trouble that fall. though the trouble had not yet put on its true face. Gideon Vane owed the Front Range Cattlemen's Bank $2,400 against the ranch. His father had built the place with a wagon and a bull and a bad temper, and his father's name was on the deed, and Gideon would have walked into fire before he let a bank clerk scratch it off. The note came due at the fall drive, before first snow. His 900 head were the only money he had, or would ever have, and every one of them had to walk to the rail and sell for the note to clear. He was 43. A widower like she was a widow, though the town did not hold his loss against him the way it held hers against her. He had lost his wife to a hard birth 4 years back, and the child with her, and he had not spoken of it since. In the barn he kept her mare, a fine-boned bay he never rode, and never sold, and never explained. Some nights he stood at the stall with his hand on the mare's neck, and let himself be, for a quarter hour, the man he'd been before. Then he put the door up and went back to being the man the ranch needed. He was a good rancher, and a proud one, and pride is a thing that reads the world through fences. Gideon looked at a man and saw his acres. He looked at Della Rourke, on the rare times he looked at her at all, and he saw a half-acre of stone and a thin coat, and he did the arithmetic every man in that valley did, and got the same wrong answer. Thin coat. Thin mind. He'd have been ashamed to say it out loud. But he thought it. That was the trouble with a man like Gideon. The cruelty lived in the thinking, where he never had to face it. The first steer went down in the west section on a Tuesday. A hand named Cole found it at mid-morning, standing wrong. Its head hung low, and it swung that head side to side, slow, like it was following a fly no one else could see. Its eyes had gone strange, wide and flat and glassy, and when Cole rode up close, the animal did not spook and did not run. It stared through him at a middle distance and pawed the ground and staggered, and one back leg buckled and caught, and it kept on staring at that nothing while its own body failed it. By Thursday there were 6 of them. By the next Tuesday, better than 30 head walking that same drunken walk, blind to fences, deaf to the dogs, wasting though the grass under their feet was tall and green and good. They wouldn't water. That was the queer part the hands kept coming back to. Turn a healthy steer out, and it drinks. These stood at the trough and looked at the water like they'd forgotten what it was for. The foreman was a square hard man named Rufus Pell, and Pell had a foreman's certainty, which is the worst kind. He decided it was the water. Bad water, tainted somehow, up in the seep where the west herd drank. He said it with the confidence of a man who has never once been made to eat his own words, and Gideon, cornered and afraid, and needing it to be something simple, let himself believe it. They fenced the seep. They drove the west herd to a new trough. And the cattle kept going blind, and kept staggering and kept dying on their feet with full stomachs, and the water had nothing to do with any of it. Della saw the first of them from her side of the shared fence. She was walking her line at dusk, the way she did, a basket on her arm, when 3 head came drifting up the slope toward the wire. She stopped. She watched the lead steer walk. She had seen that walk before, in a bad year, on another range, standing next to a Shoshone woman who had named it for her in 2 languages. High-stepping, front legs lifting too far, the head swinging, the eyes gone to that flat blind shine. The animal walked into the fence, not near it, into it. Chest to the wire, and it stood there pushing, gently, endlessly, like the fence was a thing it meant to walk through, and had all the time in the world to manage. "Loco weed," Della said. She said it quiet. She was not talking to anybody. But Pell was there, 20 feet off on his horse, come to look at the drift, and he heard her. He looked down at her over his horse's shoulder. The thin coat, the basket, the eyes on the ground. "That's so," he said. It was not a question. It was the sound a man makes when he has decided in advance that nothing you say could matter. "You a cattle doctor now, missus? Along with your egg selling?" One of the younger hands laughed, and Pell let the laugh sit there and warm him. "It's the water," he said. Vane's got it handled. "You stick to your hens," and he reined around and rode off, and the young hand went with him, and Della stood at the fence with her basket while the blind steer pushed and pushed against the wire and got nowhere. She could have let it go. She had let 100 things go. Letting things go was how she'd stayed unremembered, and unremembered was how she'd stayed safe. And there was a strong, sure voice in her that said, "Walk home, woman. It isn't yours." They didn't ask. But the steer pushed at the wire. And the light went gold and low over the range, honey-colored, coming through the sage sideways the way it did in the last hour, and something in the tenderness of that light and the stupidity of that dying got into her and would not be put down. That night she went out by moonlight. She knew where the loco weed grew. She had known for weeks, the way she knew where every plant in that valley stood, because knowing plants was the one wealth nobody could take from her and nobody thought to envy. It grew thick in a north-facing draw in the west section, a low silver-leafed thing with a pale purple bloom, pretty as a garden flower and patient as a snake. In a wet year it came up early and green when the good grass was still short, and the cattle, hungry after winter, ate it before they knew better. And once a steer got the taste, it wanted nothing else. It would walk past a whole meadow of sweet grass to stand in the poison and eat itself blind. She found the first downed steer of the latter fees just inside the wire, where the hands had left it because they'd given it up. It was on its side, breathing, that flat eye rolling. A good young steer, worth money Gideon could not spare to lose. Della knelt in the wet grass in the dark and got to work. She had come prepared. She'd spent the evening at Tom's mortar. In her basket was a black decoction she'd boiled down bitter and thick from the low black-rooted plant, and a twist of powdered charcoal she made herself from hardwood in a covered pit, and a crock of black-strap molasses she'd bought a spoonful at a time and hoarded like coin. The charcoal to bind the poison the animal had eaten, the bitter decoction to move it, the molasses to make a sick, ruined animal swallow any of it at all, because a locoed steer has forgotten how to want, and you cannot cure what will not eat. She mixed it in a bucket with her hands. She talked to the steer the whole time, low and even, the same tone she used on the mortar and the hens and the wind. She got its head up against her knee. She worked her fingers into the side of its mouth and got the first of the mixture in, and it fought her weakly, and then, tasting the molasses under the bitter, it swallowed. And swallowed again. She dosed it slow, over an hour, kneeling in the cold until her legs had no feeling left, and when it had taken all she'd brought, she got it standing. That was the hard part. A locoed steer does not want to walk where you point it. It wants the poison. She got a rope on it, and she leaned her whole weight into leading it, not back to the trough, but up and over the rise, off the tainted draw entirely, to a bench of ground on the ridge where a low restorative forb grew that she had gathered by that same moonlight and scattered before it in a green trail. A plant that steadied a ruined gut. A plant no cattle doctor 40 miles off had ever heard of. She led that staggering animal up out of the poison and onto the clean forb, step by foot for step, in the dark, alone. And nobody watched. And nobody would ever know, and she did it anyway. By dawn the steer put its head down and pulled a mouthful of the forb, and then it walked 10 feet to the seep, and it drank. Della sat on a rock and watched it drink, and let herself feel, for 1 minute, the thing she never let herself feel. Not pride, exactly, something older and quieter. The sense of a hand that still knew its work. Then she gathered her bucket and went home before the light brought the hands. She could not keep it hidden. That was the thing about doing the impossible in the dark. The impossible was still there in the morning for anyone to see. The steer they'd written off stood up and grazed and drank, and Cole found it, and Cole was not a fool. He looked at the fresh churned ground and the rope marks and the trail of scattered green leading up the ridge. And he followed it with his eyes to the little cabin on the half-acre, and he took off his hat and scratched his head and went and told the foreman. Pell did not like it. A man like Pell has staked his whole self on being the one who knows, and he cannot abide being shown, least of all by a woman with dirt under her nails. He stood in the yard in front of the hands, all 9 of them, and Gideon came out on the porch to hear it, and Pell made his little speech. So the egg woman crept onto ladder fee ground in the dark, he said, loud for the crew, and poured some Indian brew down a sick steer, and now she'll have us believing she's saved it. I've been running cattle 30 years. I know what I know. That steer'd have come around on its own, and she jumped in front of it to take the shine. Next, she'll want paying. He spat. We don't take cattle cents from a woman who can't feed a chicken. The hands laughed. They were meant to. And Gideon Vane stood on his porch and heard his foreman mock the woman who had cured what his whole outfit could not, and he did not laugh. But he did not stop it either. He looked at the half-acre across the range, the thin coat he'd seen at the fence, and he did the arithmetic, and he said nothing. He told himself Pell was likely right. He told himself a poor widow with a garden could not possibly know a thing his 30-year foreman didn't. It was easier to believe. It cost him nothing to believe. And that was the shape of the man that fall, that the truth was standing across the fence, grazing, cured, and he chose the comfortable lie because the lie fit the size of the coat. But the cattle kept dying. That was the trouble with a comfortable lie in a hard year. The range did not care what a man chose to believe. 2 more head went blind by week's end, and 4 the week after. And Pell's bad water theory grew thinner every day, and the fear in the outfit grew fatter. 900 head. A note due before snow. And a sickness with no bottom to it, taking 2, 4, 6 a week, walking the ranch's whole future off a cliff 1 blind steer at a time. Della watched it from her side of the wire and said nothing more. She had said her 2 words and been laughed at, and the old strong voice in her said, "That's the last time. Keep to your hens." But she walked her line every dusk, and every dusk she read the range like a page, and she saw what the men could not see, because the men were looking at the cattle and Della was looking at the ground. She saw where the poison lived. She saw that it was not the whole west section at all, but one draw, one north-facing fold of ground where the loco weed had taken hold thick and early, and that the cattle drifted into that draw and got the taste and carried the madness out with them. Fence that draw. Move the herd off it and up onto the clean high grass. Dose the ones already sick. That was the whole of it. Simple as bread, if you had eyes that read plants instead of pride. The chance came on a gray afternoon when Gideon rode the fence line himself, because a frightened man cannot sit still, and found her there with her basket. He drew rein. He did not tip his hat. But he did not ride on, either, and that was new. You told Pell it was the loco, he said. It came out harder than he meant. A man asking a question he's ashamed to be asking. I did, said Della. She kept her eyes down. Habit. He says it's the water. He can say it. She looked up then, once, and it surprised him, the level of it. Your water's clean. Your grass is clean. There's one draw in the west section, the north fold under the red rock, where the loco came up early and thick this spring. Your cattle drift down into it and take the taste and carry it out. Fence that draw. Move your herd up onto the high grass, the far bench. Keep them off the low fold entirely. The sick ones I can doctor, but you'll not stop it till you take the poison away from the well ones. She looked back at the ground. That's all. That's the whole of it. Gideon sat his horse. Every reflex in him said Pell had 30 years, and this woman had a garden. But he had ridden that draw. He had seen the silver leaf thick in the red rock fold, and thought it pretty, and thought nothing more. And her voice had no beg in it, and no shine grabbing in it. She had told him plainly, and then looked away, like whether he believed her was no concern of hers. And there is nothing on this earth that sounds more like the truth than that. He put it to Pell that evening. Fence the north fold, move the herd to the far bench. And Pell dug in like a mule, because it was her plan, and a man like Pell would sooner lose cattle than lose face. It's the water, he said. You start listening to that woman, and the whole valley'll laugh us off the range. And Gideon stood in the barn, with his dead wife's mare breathing soft in the dark stall behind him, and made the hardest small choice of his life to that point, which was to let a poor widow be right in front of his foreman. Fence the fold, he said. Move them to the bench. Tonight, Pell's face went to stone. But it was Gideon's name on the deed, and Gideon's note at the bank, and Pell moved the herd. The dying slowed, not stopped, but slowed, plain enough for even a proud man to count. Fewer went blind on the clean high grass. The ones already sick, Della doctored, 1 and 2 at a time, moving quiet through the west section at dusk with her bucket and her bitter black brew, and the hands stopped laughing when she passed, which is not the same as respect, but is the ground respect grows in. And then the bull went loco. He was the pride of the latter fee, a deep-chested breeding bull worth more than any 10 steers, worth more than Della's whole half-acre and everything on it. He had gotten into the fold before they fenced it, and gotten the taste bad. And one morning he came up out of the low ground foaming and blind mad and terrible, not staggering like the steers. Charging, a locoed steer wastes quiet. A locoed bull that size, full of spring and fury, goes off like dynamite. He put a horse to the ground and near killed the hand on it. He tore through a section of fence like it was string. He stood in the corral they finally hazed him into, streaming foam, swinging that great blind head, pawing up gouts of dirt, and any man who came near the rails he charged, and the rails groaned. The hands wanted him shot. It was the sane thing. It was the only thing. A blind mad bull is death on 4 legs, and no rope in the world holds him. Pell had the shotgun already broken over his arm, loading, and the loss of that bull was a loss Gideon could not afford stacked on all the others. But a dead bull was better than a dead man, and Gideon, gray-faced, gave the nod. Della climbed up on the top rail. She'd come with her bucket. Grain, this time sweet with molasses, and dosed heavy with the bitter cure ground fresh that morning in Tom's mortar. Nobody had sent for her. She'd heard the commotion from her half-acre and come at a run, and now she stood up on the rail of a corral that held a foaming mad bull, a poor widow in a thin coat, and every man on the latter fief stared at her like she'd lost her wits. "Don't shoot him," she said. "Get down, you fool woman," Pell snapped, before he, "Don't." Shoot him, she was already over the rail. There was no sound then but the bull's breathing and the men's. She stepped down into the corral dirt, and she did not run, and she did not freeze. She walked. Slow, angled, never straight at him. Her eyes soft and low, the bucket held out to the side, and she made a sound in her throat, low and even, the same sound she made to the mortar, and the hens, and the wind, and the blind steers in the dark. A sound with no fear in it, because she had learned long ago to put the fear somewhere else and go on without it. The bull swung his blind head toward her. He pawed. He took a step, and she stopped, and let him have the stopping. She set the bucket down in the dirt where the molasses smell could reach him, and she stepped back from it, still making that sound, and she waited. A locoed animal is a starving one, however full its belly. It has forgotten how to want anything but the poison, and the one thing that can reach through the madness is a want older than the poison, sweetness, salt, the memory of grain. The bull smelled the molasses. He swung toward it. He put his blind muzzle down into the bucket, and, foam and all, he ate. Della stood 6 feet off and talked to him while he ate the cure with the grain, and the bitter went down under the sweet the way it always did, and the men on the rails did not breathe. It took an hour. She fed him a second bucket by hand at the end of it, her palm flat under his dripping muzzle, and the fury went out of him by inches, the pawing first, then the swinging head. Then the terrible stillness of him easing into an ordinary tired animal standing in a corral, blowing, spent. She got a rope on him herself. She led him to the shade. Then she climbed back over the rail and picked up her empty buckets and walked home across the range without a word to any of them, her eyes on the ground, taking up as little of the world as a body could. 9 men and a shotgun, and a poor widow had done with a bucket, and her voice what all their guns could not. Gideon Vane stood at the rail and watched her go, small and plain against the gold evening, and something in the man cracked clean through. Not all at once. A crack is quiet. But he stood there with his father's ranch dying around him and his foreman's shotgun still broken over his arm, and he understood, in the place a man understands things before he'll say them, that he had been wrong about the size of that coat, that the arithmetic he'd done his whole life was the wrong arithmetic, that the richest thing on his range that evening had just walked home to a half-acre of stone because not one of them had ever thought to ask her name. He did not know yet what he'd do about it. He only knew the lie had stopped being comfortable, and out past the corral, in the high grass on the far bench where she'd told him to move them, 900 head that were supposed to be dying stood grazing in the last of the light, and the note was still due before snow, and the poison was still in the ground, and the woman who alone knew how to fight it was already gone over the rise. Unthanked, unpaid, and unowed to any man in Cedar Bluff. She meant to keep it that way. But the range does not care what we mean. He did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table, with his father's ledger open in front of him, and a lamp turned low, and added the same column of numbers 3 times, and each time they came out the same, and each time they were wrong by about $20,400. The ledger was his father's handwriting on the first 40 pages, and his own on the rest, and somewhere in the middle the numbers had stopped growing and started going the other way, and the line where that happened was the winter his wife Cora died, and he'd sold 12 head below price just to keep the crew on. He hadn't meant to look at that page. He looked anyway. Outside, something in the herd lowed, a sound not of distress exactly, but of unease, and he got up to the window and watched the dark a while, watching for the stumbling, the fence walking. The herd had been quiet since Della moved them upslope. The quiet itself made him nervous, the way you don't trust a wound that stops hurting. He pulled his coat off the peg and went out. The night was cold enough to see his breath. He walked the fence line with a lantern, and the cattle were there, dark shapes in the draw, standing easy. A few lifted their heads to him and settled again. He counted what he could by lantern and did not find a single one walking blind or pushing into the boards, and that fact alone was more medicine than anything the stock doctor from 40 miles off had done in 3 visits at $3 a visit. He kept walking until he was past the ladder V's fence line, out past the eastern edge where the half-acre started, and he stopped. There was a light in her window. Not the yellow of a lamp left burning, but the low blue of a banked fire, the kind of light that means a body is awake inside, sitting with their own thoughts the way people sit with them in the small hours when sleep won't come. He stood outside her fence with his lantern held at his side, a grown man standing in the dark outside a woman's gate like a boy who'd lost his nerve, and he was not sure what he'd intended to say if she'd come to the door. He had not come to say anything, he decided. He had come because the numbers in the ledger could not be added differently no matter what he did, and because he was not a man who lied to himself for long, once a lie stopped holding. She needed to be asked, not told. Asked. He stood there long enough for the cold to get into his hands. Then he heard her door open, and the blue fire light widened, and she was standing in it without surprise, a shawl pulled close, looking at him across the fence with those steady gray eyes that had seen the bull come down off its madness and had not blinked once. She did not say, "What are you doing here?" She did not say anything. She only waited in the way of a woman who has learned that silence costs less than words and watched him figure out what he was going to do with himself. He turned his hat in his hands. Then he stopped turning it, because a man's hands moving like that told a woman he was afraid, and he had come here to be honest, not to be pitied. "I can't pay the doctor from 40 miles off again," he said. "I can't pay him and pay the note both. And he hasn't done a thing your steer didn't do better in one night." She said nothing. The blue light moved on her face. "I'm not asking for charity," he said. "I've never asked a soul for charity, and I won't start at a widow's gate. I'm asking to hire you. Wages, whatever the stock doctor got, you get, and you get it whether the herd lives or dies. Because that's how a man pays honest work." The cold had his hands now. He made himself finish it. "Della, I need you to save my cattle, all of them, before the snow." For a long moment she only looked at him. A man could have counted to 10 in that quiet. Somewhere behind her the fire ticked in its bed. "You know what the town says about me," she said. "I know what they say. You'll be hiring the woman they think can't feed a chicken. Your foreman said it in front of 9 men. It'll be all over Cedar Bluff by Sunday that Gideon Vane put his herd in a widow's apron. Let them say it. They will. Let them." He looked past her at the fire a moment, then back. "I stood at my own fence tonight and counted cattle that ought to be dead standing up eating. I don't care what a town says about the reason they're breathing. I care that they're breathing." She pulled the shawl closer. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It had gone from careful to something with a floor under it. "Then hear me before you say it twice," she said. "If I do this, I do it my way, start to finish. You fence what I tell you to fence. You move them where I say. Your foreman does what I say, or he doesn't come near the sick ones, and I'll not have a shotgun cocked behind me every time I walk into a corral. A locoed animal can smell fear, and a man's fear is louder than mine ever will be. Done. You don't want to think on it? I've done nothing but think on it for a week." He set the hat back on his head. "Della, will you doctor my herd?" She stepped back from the door and held it open, and the blue light spilled out onto the frost between them. "Come in out of the cold," she said. "You'll be no use to me froze, and there's something on my table you're going to have to learn to use." He crossed the little yard and came into her cabin, and it was warm and close and smelled of dried green things hung from the beams. And there on the plank table sat a wooden mortar and pestle worn smooth as a river stone, and he did not yet know that Tom Rourke had carved it, or what it would mean to him before the winter was out. She burned her caution that night. She had spent 2 winters staying small, staying quiet, being the widow at the fence line who owed no one and asked for nothing. Now she stood in her own kitchen and told a man she would stake her name on 900 head of cattle in front of the whole valley, and once she had said it out loud there was no walking it back. She knew it. She said it anyway. The sickness crested the following week, on the worst night of it, when the wind came down off the divide with the first hard cold in it, and 3 steers went down in the space of an hour. Della did not panic, and so no one else did either. That was the first thing the crew learned about her. She came into the yard with her basket over her arm, and she gave orders in a plain, flat voice, like a woman telling children to wash for supper, and the men found themselves doing what she said before they had decided whether to. "Fence the draw under the red rock," she told the foreman. "The whole north-facing fold. Not tomorrow. Tonight, that silver-leafed plant with the purple bloom is what's killing them, and they'll walk to it in the dark like it's candy, because that's what the poison does. It makes them want the thing that's killing them." Rufus Pell stood with his thumbs in his belt and 30 years of cattle behind him, and did not move. "I've drove stock since before you could walk," he said. "Then you'll be quick about the fence," she said, and turned her back on him and went to the first down steer, and after a moment Pell spat and told 2 hands to bring wire. Because Gideon was standing right there, and had not said a word to countermand her, and that silence from the boss was its own order. She showed them her method in the barn by lantern, with the wind shaking the boards. She had them build a mash of grain, and the blackstrap molasses she brought by the crock, and into it she worked the powdered charcoal to bind the poison, and the bitter black decoction of the black-rooted plant to purge it, and the molasses to hide the taste so a sick animal would swallow what its own tongue told it to refuse. "The charcoal holds the loco so it can't do more harm," she said, working it with her hands so they could see. "The bitter drink moves it out. The molasses is the lie that gets them to take the medicine. Every one of you learns to mix it tonight. Because I've got 2 hands, and there's 900 head, and I can't be in the barn and the draw and the high bench all at once." They learned it. 9 men who 3 weeks back had laughed at a woman who couldn't feed a chicken stood shoulder to shoulder in the lantern light and learned to grind a widow's cure. And by the gray of morning the losses had stopped climbing. Not one new steer went down after sunup. The men counted it themselves and did not say much, but the way a man carries a bucket changes when he believes there's something worth carrying, and by noon they were carrying them that way. Gideon carried them that way too. And on the 4th day, in the barn between doses, he came and stood at the table where she was grinding the black root fine, and he watched her hands, and then he said, "Show me." She moved over. He took up the pestle. It sat wrong in his hand, too small, and he ground it like a man breaking rock, and she put her hand over his and slowed him. "Not down," she said. "Around. You're not crushing it, you're waking it up. Let the wood do the work. Tom made it to do the work. Tom made this. The winter before the fever took half the valley. A friend taught me the plants that year. He carved this so I'd have a proper thing to grind them in instead of 2 stones. She took her hand off his. There. Around. You've got it." He had it, his rough hands beside hers, on the smooth old wood, grinding a dead man's mortar full of the medicine that was keeping his ranch alive, and for a while neither of them said anything, and the not saying was louder than any word either of them owned. It was that same week that Ambrose Thorpe came riding. He came in a good coat with his daughter beside him on a fine gray horse, and he sat in Gideon's kitchen and drank Gideon's coffee and looked at the ledger left open on the table like a man reading a hand of cards he already knew he'd won. $600, Thorpe said. "Cash, on the deed, this week. I know what the note is, Vane. I know when it's due. You'll not make the drive with a herd staggering blind. And when the snow comes, the bank takes it for nothing, and I buy it from them for less than I'm offering you now out of neighborly feeling." "The herd's not staggering," Gideon said. "Go look at it. I heard about your remedy." Thorpe smiled without any warmth in it at all. "The whole county's heard. You've got the Rourke widow feeding your cattle Indian poison out of a molasses crock and calling it medicine." He set the cup down. "There's a cleaner road. Gideon, Cornelia here. You join the latter fee to my grass and my water. The note disappears. And you never take orders from a barefoot herb woman again. A man in your spot ought to think hard on which way the sensible thing lies." Cornelia Thorpe sat very straight and said nothing, correct and cool as a winter window, and she was not unkind and not cruel, only certain, the way her father was certain, that everything had a price and hers had been agreed on before the coffee was poured. Della was in the yard when they said it. The window was open. She heard the offer, and she heard the daughter's name in it, and she heard the pause where Gideon should have said no to all of it, and only said no to the $600. He refused the sale. He did not refuse the daughter. He let Thorpe ride off, with the door still open on that second thing, and Della picked up her basket and went back to the barn and ground the black root very fine, and did not let her face do anything at all. 2 days on, he mended her wagon. She had not asked him to. The axle hinge on her old cart had cracked a spoke of iron the spring before, and she had learned to nurse it, to load light and take the ruts slow. She came out of the barn at dusk and found him under it with a hammer and a bar and a length of strap iron he'd brought from the Ladder V forge, and he did not look up, and he did not make a thing of it. "It'll carry a load now," was all he said, and slid out from under it and wiped his hands and went back to the sick pens. She stood and looked at the mended hinge a long time. It was a small thing. It was the smallest thing. It was a man fixing the one part of her life she'd been quietly ashamed of and saying nothing so she wouldn't have to thank him. And she found she had to go stand behind the barn a minute before she trusted her own face again. He asked her, near the end of it, where a widow learned frontier medicine. They were on her porch. The herd was mending. The nights were colder, and the draws were fenced, and there was, for the first time in weeks, an hour with nothing in it that needed doing right that second. And that hour was more dangerous than any of the work had been. "You never say," he said, "where it comes from. The plants. The mash. A body doesn't guess a cure for locoweed. Somebody taught you." She was quiet a while. Then she decided he had earned the truth, and that she was tired to the bone of guarding it. "Gray willow," she said. "A Shoshone woman. The year the fever came through, I nursed her. She'd have died in the draw where she'd made her camp, and I brought her into the cabin, and I sat with her the way you'd sit with anyone. When she was strong, she stayed the season, and she paid me the only way she had. She walked me out over that whole range and put a name to every plant on it and told me which ones killed and which ones cured and which ones did both depending on the hand." She looked at him. "That's where it comes from. From an Indian woman, the whole of Cedar Bluff would have ridden off the range with rifles. So now you know. And now you can decide whether you still want her poison in your molasses crock." She watched his face for the flinch. She had watched 100 faces for that flinch over 2 years, and it had always come. It did not come. "She sounds," he said slowly, "like the smartest neighbor this valley ever had, and nobody had the sense to know it." He looked out at his cattle in the dark, same as it never had the sense to know you. And there on the porch he almost said the other thing. She saw it come up in him. She saw his jaw work with it. The word was right there in the cold between them, and it would have changed everything. And then, off in the dark, a steer bawled once, long and wrong, and he was up and off the porch and gone toward the sound before either of them could find out what he'd have done with the word, and the almost of it hung in the air after him for a long time. The mare went down 3 days later. She was Cora's mare. The fine-boned bay Gideon's dead wife had ridden. Kept in the barn 4 years, and never sold, and never ridden. The last living thing that had been Cora's. And the mare had gotten into the Loco early, before Della ever set foot on the ladder fee, back when Pell was still blaming the water. She'd been too far gone before the first dose ever touched her. The poison had already done its work deep in her, in the places charcoal couldn't reach. And Della had known it the first time she looked in the animal's eyes, and had said so plainly, and had treated her anyway because Gideon asked, and because you don't stop trying on the one that's already the man's whole grief. The bay died at dawn in her stall with Della's hand on her neck and Gideon standing in the door, and it did not die easy, and there was nothing in any basket in the world that would have made it die easy. Thorpe's word was waiting for that death like a trap set weeks before. Because by then, the town was already muttering. Heathen witchery, Thorpe had been saying, in the mercantile, and at the bank, and to every rider who'd carry it. Indian poison, not medicine. He'd been saying it low and steady, and it had soaked into Cedar Bluff the way water soaks into a dry field, and now the finest horse on the ladder feeve lay dead under the widow's own hand. And the muttering came up out of the ground all at once, and became a voice. The Rourke woman's cure killed Gideon Vane's mare. It ran the valley by noon. It did not carry the part where the mare was dying before Della came. A story never carries that part. By evening there were men who had drunk her cure into their own cattle, standing in the mercantile, nodding along that maybe there'd been something wrong in that molasses all along. And Rufus Pell, who had learned to grind the black root with his own hands, stood among them, and did not say one word in her defense, because a man who's been proved wrong all season will grab the first chance the crowd offers him to be right. And Gideon said nothing. That was the wound. Not Thorpe, not the town. Thorpe was only being Thorpe, and the town was only being the town. But Gideon Vane stood in the loading yard, with the note bearing down on him, and his dead wife's mare not yet cold, and the crowd's eyes on him, waiting to see which way he'd jump. And he was gutted, and he was cornered, and his pride reached up and closed his throat, and he let them talk about her, and did not open his mouth. He looked at the ground. And the woman who had brought his bull down off its madness by hand and stopped his herd dying stood 10 feet from him in front of the whole town and watched him study the dirt. She did not weep. She did not shout. She had spent 2 years learning that silence costs less than words, and she spent it now. She left Cedar Bluff at dawn. She loaded her wagon light on the axle he'd mended, the garden dug and bundled, the dried things off the beams, and she took the road east out of the valley in the gray with the frost on everything, and the same town that had watched her dig her husband's grave watched her go from behind their curtains and did not lift a hand. She left the mortar and pestle behind. She had not meant to. She had packed it, and then she had stood in the barn with it in her hands, the smooth old wood Tom had carved, and she found she could not carry the weight of it out of that place. Too much had happened over it. She set it down on the ranch house table where Gideon would find it, and she left it there, and she drove out of Cedar Bluff, owing no one, and unowed, exactly as she had always said she wanted to be, and it was the loneliest thing she had ever done. The herd turned the corner 4 days after she was gone. That was the thing no slander could argue with. The cattle she'd doctored, the mash she'd mixed, the draws she'd fenced, and the clean forb she'd moved them onto, it all did its work on its own schedule. And its schedule did not care what the mercantile was saying. The sick ones stopped being sick. The wasted ones put weight back on. The blind, mad eyes cleared. Day after day, the latter fee herd got stronger and fatter and calmer on the high bench, and every rider who went up to check them came back down quieter than he'd gone up, because it is a hard thing to stand in a field of living cattle you called dead and keep believing the woman who saved them was a witch. Drive day came before first snow, as it had to. The whole town came to the loading pens by the rail, the way a town comes to anything that might turn into a hanging or a wedding, not sure which they'd get. Thorpe's outfit came, Thorpe himself up on his gray with Cornelia beside him, come to watch the latter fee bring a broken remnant to the rail and fail to make the note. The banksman came with his book. And Gideon Vane brought his cattle down off the bench. He brought 860 living head to the rail. A herd everyone in that valley had written off as dead by lantern light 3 weeks before came down the chute in a river of horn and hide, fat and clear-eyed and bawling, and the tally clerk stood on the fence and counted them through, and when he was done he read the number out loud so the whole town heard it. 860 head. Nobody said anything. The men who had said witchery stood in the count and could not make it be a smaller number by wanting it. 860. Enough to make the drive. Enough, with the drive money, to clear a $2,400 note before the snow with room left over. The animals she had doctored were the ones breathing, and there is no argument in the world that beats a number a whole town can see with its own eyes. Gideon climbed up on the loading chute where every soul in Cedar Bluff could hear him. He was not a man who made speeches. He made this one. "Every one of you knows what my herd looked like a month ago," he said. "You rode past it to fetch a doctor from 40 miles off. You know what it looks like today. 860 head. You just heard the man count them." He let that sit. There is one person in this valley who knew what was killing them when nobody else did. Who named the plant and the draw it grew in when my own foreman was blaming the water. Who walked into a corral with a mad bull in it that 9 men wanted to shoot and brought it down with a bucket of grain and her own 2 hands. Her name is Della Rourke. The name went across the crowd like a stone across a pond. You called her a witch, Gideon said. You called her medicine heathen poison. My wife's mare died, and you needed a reason, and Ambrose Thorpe handed you one, and you took it because it was easier than telling yourselves you'd been wrong about a poor woman for 2 years. His voice cracked, and he let it. The mare was dying before Della Rourke ever touched her. I knew it. She told me plain. I let her try anyway, because I'm a fool who couldn't stand to lose the last thing that was Cora's. And when that horse died, I stood right here and let you blame the one person who saved everything else I own. I said nothing. That's the worst thing my pride ever did, and I'll carry it. Then he turned on the chute and looked down at Thorpe, up on his fine gray horse. You offered me $600 for this ranch, Gideon said, loud, so it carried. You counted her acres and called her poor. Well, she counted my cattle's breaths, and she called 900 head back from the dead, and there's 860 of them standing at your feet. Out here the land keeps the only ledger that matters, Colonel, and the land says that barefoot herb woman is the richest person in this whole valley, and every dollar you own can't buy you the one thing she carries in a basket. Thorpe opened his mouth. He was a man who always had a figure ready. He had no figure for this. He sat his horse in the silence with the whole town looking at him, and there was no number he could say that would answer 860 living head, and after a moment he turned the gray's head and rode it slow out of the yard, and Cornelia went with him, correct and cool to the last. And that was the end of the Thorpes in Cedar Bluff. Gideon rode out to her the next morning. She had stopped 40 miles on, at a creek where the road forked, not because she had anywhere to be, but because the mule needed rest, and so, if she was honest, did she. He came up the road hard and reined in at her fire, and got down off his horse, and took off his hat. And in his other hand, he carried the mortar and pestle wrapped in a piece of clean sacking. He did the grovel with a price on it. That was the only kind worth anything, and he knew it. I turned Thorpe down, he said, the daughter and the money and the note gone with a signature. All of it. I'd rather make that note the hard way with my own cattle than pay it with a marriage I don't feel and a lie about who saved my ranch. He unwrapped the sacking. This is yours. You left it on my table. I've no right to it. Tom made it for you, and I've been grinding your medicine in it like it was mine to use. And I've come to give it back. She looked at it, and did not take it yet. I told the whole town at the pens, he said, by your name. I told them what I did and what I failed to do, and I told them what you are. It's 4 days late, and it should have been said with the mare not cold, and I said it late instead of never, and I know the difference between those doesn't buy back the morning I let you drive out of that valley alone. He held the mortar out. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I love you. You'd be right not to believe a man who found his voice only after the count came in his favor. I'll tell you the one true thing I've got. He swallowed. I don't know the half of what you know. About the land, the plants, any of it. I've measured people my whole life by their fences, and I was wrong every time, and you're the proof. So I'm not asking you to keep house. I'm asking you to teach me. I want to learn the range from the one person who ever really knew it. Come back and teach me. For a long moment there was only the creek and the fire. Then she reached out and took the mortar from his hands, and she held it against her the way you'd hold something living, and she gave him back the smallest word she owned, and the most total. Stay, she said. The note cleared that fall at the bank window in Cedar Bluff, paid in full with drive money and a little put-by, and when the new deed was drawn it carried 2 names on it, Vane and Rourke both, and the bank's man read them out and stamped it. And the same town that had watched her dig a grave with her own hands 2 winters back stood at the church social that Sunday and watched Della Rourke stand as mistress of the latter fee, and did not know quite where to put its eyes. She did not gloat. That was never in her. When the women who'd ridden past her door came up to her stiff and shamefaced, she poured them coffee and asked after their children, and let the shame be theirs to carry, since it was theirs to begin with. And when anyone asked, she told them plain about Grey Willow, the Shoshone woman who'd taught her every plant on that range, and she made them say the name back, and the slander that had chased her out of the valley had no air left to breathe in a valley that had counted 860 head. By spring the tainted draws under the red rock fold were fenced and healing. The silver-leafed Loco pulled back where the cattle couldn't reach it, and there were calves on the clean grass of the west section, wobbling and butting and dropping down to sleep in the sun. Gideon could name the good plants now. Not all of them. Enough that his wife did not laugh at him more than a little. The wooden mortar and pestle sat on the mantel of the ranch house where anyone coming in the door would see it first. It was not a tool anymore. It had stopped being a thing for survival somewhere over that hard winter and become a thing for home. And each spring Della set a fresh green cutting of the black-rooted plant beside it, the antidote that had called a herd back from the dead. So the thing that had once been about staying alive would sit there being about staying, plain and simple. Instead, word came, once, that Ambrose Thorpe had sold out and moved on down the line, his water and his grass and his certainty all gone to somebody else's ledger. Gideon read it and set it down and said only one thing about it, and it was the truest thing either of them ever said about the man. The colonel measured people by their fences, he said. The land measured back. And that is the whole of it. That worth is not the acres under your name, or the coat on your back, or what the town decides you are from behind its curtains. Worth is what you can do when everyone else is stumped, and whether you'll still do it for people who never once did anything for you. Della Rourke knew a plant nobody else knew, and it cost her everything to be right in front of people who needed her to be wrong, and in the end, the only ledger that mattered came out in her favor. Because the land does not lie, and the cattle do not care what a mercantile says, they only care who kept them breathing. If you've ever been judged by your dress instead of your heart, you already know how this one felt to write. Tell me the town you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this story has ridden.